Throughout World War II, the United States played a significant role in helping the Allies gain the victory against the Axis powers. The Allies consisted of Britain, France, and Russia, and the Axis powers consisted of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Most people look upon World War II as the more brutal of the two world wars. If not for entering of the United States into World War II, many more lives would have been killed and the world would have been shaped differently than it is today. Germany could have complete control over Europe and maybe even the world, but the U.S. was able to stop the Germans from gaining more land. Since the beginning of September 1939, Germany was looking to gain control of the Atlantic Ocean. Great Britain and the Soviet Union didn't want Germany to gain control of the Atlantic Sea because the sea was a trading route for them to receive food supplies and warfare materials. Because Great Britain had a strong navy and the Germans could not match up with their battleships, the Germans decided to make a new plan called the U-boats. Since Germany had a change in their plan, Great Britain naval had a difficult time dealing with the German U-boats in the Atlantic. Because of the difficulties from the German U-boats, the leader of the Soviet Union, Churchill, met up with the United States President Franklin Roosevelt to ask him for help in the Battle of the Atlantic. The president agreed to give them brief assistance in the war. By the United States entering the Battle of the Atlantic, it allowed them to give Great Britain military help with ships and military escorts for convoys. If the United States didn't help the Soviet Union and Great Britain in the Battle of the Atlantic, Great Britain and the Soviet Union would have lost their access to food and war equipment. By losing the access to food and equipment, it would have eventually killed the people who were fighting, and they wouldn't have the materials to fight against the Germans. The Battle of the Atlantic would have ended quickly.
D-Day was the largest amphibious offensive in history. D-Day was also one of the deadliest days ever for the United States. Before D-Day, there was Operation Overlord, which was the code name for the invasion of Northwest Europe. Operation Neptune was what was created in order to get a foothold in Europe. Another goal of the operation was to capture Caen because it was an important city for a road junction and it was good for the construction of airfields. Operation Neptune began June 6, 1994, and ended June 30th when the Allies gained their foothold. The important allies of the battle included Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The attacks were spread out along the Normandy coast, along 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword Beach. Each of the allies were assigned a certain beach. Gold and Sword beaches were occupied by the British, Juno Beach was occupied by the Canadians, and Utah and Omaha beaches were occupied by the United States. The largest death count was at the Omaha beach, although most of the beaches were lined with gunmen, mines, wooden stakes, and barbed wire, which made the invasion more difficult. The invasion led to the liberation of Nazi France, the beginning of invasions on Western Europe controlled by Germany, and helped the Allies overall in the war. D-Day was also the beginning of the threatening of Germany's control because most of the attacks were far away from Germany. The United States contributed by beating the Germans at both of their beaches. If they were not to have joined the war, D-Day would have been lost to the Germans and the war would have taken a turn for the worst. For example, instead of the liberation of Nazi France, there would probably have been more violence and oppression in France and all around Europe. D-Day was also a battle that led to the downfall of the Axis' power. If D-Day had been lost, the war would have been in favor of the Germans and the Axis powers.
Battle of the Bulge was the final major German offensive of the war. With the Russians closing in from the east and the Americans and British on the west, Germany had enough troops for one final push. With the defensive style of war the Germans had been fighting since D-Day failing, Hitler decided that they should put up a large-scale offensive, attacking through the Ardennes forest just as they had done back at the start of the war in 1940. Germany attacked resting American troops in the region. These Americans were either very fatigued or fresh off the boat, as intel had led the Americans to believe that this area area was only lightly guarded by the Germans, with most men stationed there being either too young or too old to serve elsewhere. In reality, there was a massive German force waiting there to mount the largest German offensive since the Americans and British began pushing into Europe. This massive German force waited until Cloudy Day to attack in hopes that the American and British pilots would be unable to provide air support. This worked, and on the first day, the Germans were able to push straight through the original line of troops, mainly as a result of the aforementioned low quality of troops in the region and the lack of air support. The Americans did their best, but the Germans continued to push towards their goal of taking Antwerp. It took until December the 21st for the Americans to halt this advance, as the furthest ahead German division ran out of supplies due to a missed airdrop and was forced to push through enemy lines that now surrounded them to return to the rest of the Germans. The Americans attempted to push the Germans back on January 1st, but one of their two generals waited until the third day to start his offensive, and the other was closing the 40-mile gap of the Bulge at just a mile a day. The biggest reason that Germany lost this had nothing to do with the Americans and everything to do with the fuel situation. Germany moved most of its troops out of the Bulge, but had to leave the tanks because they ran out of fuel. On this January 7th, Hitler officially withdrew the armies from the region, and by the end of the month, the original lines of fighting had been restored. This battle being won by the Allies didn't have a ton to do with the Americans, and had a lot more to do with the German fuel supply. At the time, the British outlook at the battle was anything but positive, and without Americans in the war, Britain would have had to fight this battle, which means the Germans could have pushed further into France. And seeing as the German resupply drops landed a few miles ahead of the German position, it is possible the Germans would have received the fuel they needed and consequently pushed all the way to Antwerp.